This is Chapter 6 of Black, based on Twisted Metal Black, developed by Incog Inc., and published by Sony Computer Entertainment of America. Jimmy lay perfectly still, prostrate under a tarpaulin in the back of the pantry, behind the kitchen, peeking out from a small fold in the plastic. The black-eyed man was letting people out, he thought nervously. He had seen a couple of them from his hiding place, wandering around in the kitchen. What's worse, he discovered Sweet Tooth's handiwork in the kitchen, although he would never know that it was the clown who had done it. Butch was slumped over by the stove next to the pantry. His head had been cut off. Jim could see the body's feet through the pantry door. He was waiting for the coast to be clear, and then he was going to run the fuck out of there. The kitchen was a big galley with an open wall where Butch would have served the food. The shadows in the cafeteria had stopped moving. It looked like he was alone. He pressed his hands to the floor and began to push up, but the pain in his left arm was too great. He eased himself back down. A puddle of blood formed underneath the arm. He had heard some bad shit about this Calypso guy. Supposedly ran some kind of illegal contest out in the desert. He remembered a conversation he had less than a year ago with one of the guards on lunch break. The guard was an ex-cop, Maximilian Stone, who was a local hero in Midtown. He told him how Calypso used to round up sketchy characters driving on the desert roads and get them to participate in his game. He'd give them guns and pit them all against each other in an anything-goes free-for-all. The lucky winner would get whatever their heart desired. Jimmy didn't quite believe that, but he was more than convinced that Calypso was a dangerous man. Calypso had killed 3 of his comrades and had shot him in the arm. He wasn't quite doing so well with it either. As he ran back inside, the black-eyed man had been unloading in his direction, and one of the bullets found its way to the meat above his elbow and out through the other side. He never knew it in all of the panic, but he had lost a lot of blood, and that is what brought the freaks to the cafeteria. They were following the red dotted line into the mess hall, and all they found was Butch. They didn't care enough to stick around, except for one. After a while, Jimmy heard something in the kitchen. The tarpaulin had slipped down over his eyes. He slowly pushed it up with the back of his hand. The dim light of the cafeteria made his eyes ache, which in turn woke up the dormant migraine that stretched all the way across his brain. He squinted his eyes and tried hard not to groan. It was damn hard to see. There was a blurry figure like a silhouette bent over by Butch's legs. It grabbed the feet and dragged the body right in front of the doorway. For a few moments, the shadow walked out of view. It made some loud noises in the kitchen, a few dishes breaking, and the clank of silverware, but eventually the figure came back into view. He was holding something in his hand, but it was too fuzzy for Jimmy to see. He was straining hard to focus and to keep a grip on himself. All he had to do was stay quiet and wait for him to leave. The figure bent down with his back facing the pantry. It was doing something to the body. It was impossible to see. Jim held his breath and focused his eyes on the floor in front of him. He slowly moved his line of sight upward, giving his eyes the chance to adjust to the distance and to the light. The figure was kneeling on the ground, working its arm back and forth. Sawing, Jim finally realized. That shadow is sawing Butch into pieces. The figure stopped, and as it put the object in its hand down, it glinted. A knife. The silhouette then put its hand on Butch's arm and began to pull. It tugged and pulled over and over, making the sick, wet sound of snapping tendons and ripping muscle fibers. The silhouette made a loud, straining groan, and Butch's arm ripped apart at the elbow. The shadow staggered back on its knees, and its head, a bare white skull, caught in the pale light. Jim felt himself breathe. Grim. The skull had reared into the light for only a second before Grim ducked back down into the shadows and began to bite and tear at the arm. The smell of blood grew thick and heavy as the freed patient ripped open the warm insides of Butch's arm with his teeth. He chomped and slurped, noisily devouring the human meat like a hungry animal. Jim retched. He hadn't meant to, and he hadn't seen it coming, but he couldn't help it. In one loud, roaring groan, he painted the floor with steak and peas. Grim shot up. Jim shuffled back and let the tarpaulin slide down over his face. The light flicked on, and a shock of pain shot all the way through his eyes to the back of his head. Grim's boots clopped on the floor. Jim held as still as he could, his head down, and his ear sitting in a puddle of puke. His heart was pounding violently, and the pool of blood under his arm advanced to the edge of the tarp. He watched with hopeless, silent dismay as the red boundary crept up to the plastic border and beyond. The tarpaulin was ripped from his back, and he pulled his legs in close to him, hunching his shoulders as he curled into the fetal position. The light was blinding, and he snapped his eyes shut. Grim's fingers grabbed his hair and yanked. Jim jerked upward and fell back on his ass, his hair still gripped firmly in Grim's fist. Blood dripped from the split halves of the skull's jaw. He twisted his grip and turned Jimmy's ear towards him. "Smooth, kid," Grim dryly laughed. Jimmy's teeth were chattering. Tears were streaming from his eyes. "Please don't kill me," he begged. Grim let go of Jimmy's hair and shredded out an amazing guitar solo. Jim blinked. The guitar was gone. Grim shook his head and grinned, his mouth sticky with gore. Jimmy began to ask, Did you just—" "I only ever killed gooks," Grim interrupted, "and that was in Nam." For a split second, Jimmy wanted to retort by bringing up the fate of Grim's rescuers, but somehow, in his injured haze, found the wisdom to decide that maybe it wasn't the smartest thing to do at the moment. "You've lost a lot of blood there," Grim said, pointing to Jimmy's arm. A parrot fluttered over and perched on Grim's shoulder. The bird squawked. "You're a big pussy, Jim!" "What did you just say?" Jim asked. "I said you've lost a lot of blood," said Grim. The parrot rolled out its forked tongue and blinked its snake eyes. Jim's sight began to fade. He weakly shook his head and gasped. "No, I was talking to the bird." And then darkness.